Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about China making another major move, appearing at the second island chain, to back up the China-US trade negotiations. Besides, there's now a Damocles sword hanging over Trump's head. The export approval period for rare earths from China and Russia is only 6 months, and production could be halted again at any time. The China-US London trade talks ended on June 11th, and a single post from Trump once spooked the market. In fact, after the talks ended, both sides only claimed that they had reached a framework agreement, but did not announce the details of the agreement. The US side said they would wait for President Trump's approval. As usual, Trump used his Truth Social account as a platform to announce US policies. On June 11th, he posted on Truth Social saying, "We have already reached an agreement with the Chinese side, just waiting for President Xi and me to give the final approval. China will fully supply the US with magnets and any rare earth materials we need. In return, the US will provide things that both sides agree on, including allowing Chinese students to study at American universities." I've always thought this was a good thing. America can get a 55% tariff, and China can get 10%. The relationship between both sides is very good. As soon as Trump posted, it immediately caught the market's attention, because he mentioned imposing a 55% tariff on China, making people wonder if the US is planning to raise tariffs again, because during the last negotiation with Indonesia, China and the US agreed to revert to the situation before the reciprocal tariff started on April 2nd, and then each side would impose what they called a 10% reciprocal tariff. Since the Trump administration had already imposed a 20% tariff on Chinese fentanyl before April 2nd, the US is actually charging China a 30% tariff, while China is charging the US a 10% tariff. However, Trump has now suddenly brought up the idea of a 55% tariff, which has sparked concerns in the market about another possible tariff hike. But later, when Commerce Secretary Luttig was interviewed by CNBC, he clarified that the 15% tariff referred to the tariffs that were already imposed during Trump's previous term. In other words, Trump is deliberately picking angles that are favorable to himself to promote and exaggerate his own achievements, but in doing so, he's causing unnecessary worries in the market. Another thing Trump exaggerated was when he said that the US didn't make any real concessions in this round of negotiations, only relaxing restrictions for Chinese students to study in the US, while China agreed to supply more rare earths and rare earth magnets to the US. This statement is also misleading. It's important to note that Trump's way with words is to say that the US will offer things that everyone would agree to, and then only mention the one thing that actually gets done. In fact, the US side probably agreed to more things. Looking back, the origin of this China-US dispute was actually Trump suddenly posting online more than 2 weeks ago, accusing China of breaking its promise. Afterwards, US officials started spreading the word that China would stop supplying rare earths, especially rare earth magnets, to the US. However, the Ministry of Commerce later issued a statement strongly refuting the claim that China broke its promise, mentioning that after the negotiations in Indonesia, the US had made at least 3 moves. First, it stopped supplying China with chip design automation software, EDA. Second, it warned foreign countries that Huawei's Ascend AI chips are unsafe. And third, it restricted Chinese students from studying in the US. And China's control over rare earth magnet exports is believed to be a response to these small moves by the US after the Indonesia meeting. It's estimated that at this London meeting, both sides agreed to cancel the escalatory actions taken after the Indonesia meeting. In other words, the US will not only cancel the measures targeting Chinese students, but will also remove other new actions taken against China. US Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo also revealed 2 details about the China-US negotiations during an interview. First, why did the meetings last 14 hours each day for those 2 days? Raimondo said the discussions went back and forth, and the Chinese side kept demanding that the US completely lift export controls. She quoted U.S. Treasury Secretary Bryson as saying to the Chinese side during the meeting, "If you really want that, then you want absolutely no export controls at all. All right then, why don't you bring your best hypersonic missile?" Is that possible? So, this kind of thing is basically impossible to happen. But Raimondo said that Bryson's comment was just meant to lighten the mood. During the meeting, everyone actually showed a lot of respect for each other. From Bryson's joke, I also picked up on something. It really seems like the US hasn't managed to develop hypersonic missiles. Second, during the negotiations, the US tried to ask China for rare earths on behalf of the whole world, but the Chinese side refused. Robney said he also tried his best to negotiate on behalf of other countries, but China was only willing to supply rare earths to the US, as this was an agreement reached with the US. If you're an American company that needs magnets, China will approve it right away. Although Ropney made it sound like China was giving special treatment to the US, in reality, China wanted other countries to negotiate with them directly, and made it clear that they must not betray China's interests during negotiations with the US, or else they might not get any rare earths at all. In addition, according to the Wall Street Journal, China could resume the supply of rare earths used in electric vehicles, wind turbines, electronic consumer products, and military equipment within weeks of the two leaders confirming the framework agreement. Besides lifting visa restrictions on Chinese students, the US will also ease new measures against China, such as allowing the export of ethylene for fresh plastics, aircraft engines, and related components. The Wall Street Journal further revealed that China's decision to resume rare earth supplies to the US is only for 6 months, using it as leverage for ongoing China-US negotiations, rather than a long-term supply commitment. In other words, if China and the US fail to reach a comprehensive agreement in the end, China will once again halt rare earth exports. To sum it up this way, first, after China and the US reached the Indonesia agreement, the US continued to roll out a series of sporadic actions targeting China. During the previous administration, the US was already doing this. The US has developed this habit, negotiating with you on one hand, while causing trouble on the other. During the Biden administration, China adopted a tolerant attitude. But now, China is no longer putting up with it. As soon as the US stirs up trouble, China immediately halts rare earth exports. In the end, this time, the London negotiations successfully put a stop to the US's new measures against China. Secondly, Trump only reports the good news and not the bad, exaggerating what the US has gained, but he didn't even mention that China announced the rare earth supply would only last for 6 months. This is like the sword of Damocles hanging over Trump's head. It could fall at any moment. If China and the US ultimately fail to reach an agreement, that sword will come down. Thirdly, even if China and the US reach a framework agreement in London, the competitive situation between the two countries will still continue, and they will still block each other in key areas. For example, the US might continue to restrict the supply of AI chips, such as NVIDIA's H20, to China. Recently, the front page of People's Daily published an interview with Huawei's founder Ren Zhengfei, specifically quoting him saying that although Chinese chips are one generation behind the US, these problems can be solved through stacking and clustering methods. China is also making its stance clear. Now that Huawei's Ascend 90C chip has caught up with NVIDIA's chips, China is no longer afraid of the US cutting off the supply of expensive AI chips. On the contrary, they will use this opportunity to strengthen domestic production, hoping to make the Ascend chip a competitor to NVIDIA. This is exactly a good opportunity to use the US-China trade war to push China towards self-reliance and self-strengthening. In addition, on the eve of the China-US talks in London, China's aircraft carrier battle groups, the Liaoning and the Shandong, made a rare simultaneous appearance in the Western Pacific. According to some mainland military experts, this is the first time that two Chinese aircraft carriers have conducted training together in the Western Pacific, which carries strategic significance. If a military conflict breaks out in the future, this region will be a key direction for China's defense, so it's crucial to conduct long-distance training with both aircraft carriers to continuously enhance overall joint operational capabilities. Japan's Ministry of Defense has tracked China's two aircraft carriers, reporting that on June 7, the Liaoning Carrier Group sailed and conducted carrier-based aircraft takeoff and landing drills east of Minamotorishima, Japan. This is the first time Chinese aircraft carriers have broken through the second island chain. During the Cold War, the United States proposed the island chain strategy to contain China, with the first island chain mainly including Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, and the Philippines. The second island chain, which the Liaoning has now broken through, consists of the Ogasawara Islands, Guam, the Caroline Islands, and others. The Liaoning was near the larger Minamotorishima, located east of the second island chain. Guam, part of the second island chain, is an unincorporated U.S. territory in the Asia-Pacific region. Japanese media believe that the appearance of China's two aircraft carriers here is meant to contain the U.S. military's deployment at this strategic location. Besides showing a stance of countering the U.S., it is also a display of military strength. And on June 10, the New York Times reported that through this Farsi patrol, China's carrier group has proven that in times of crisis, they can not only handle Japan, but also compete with the U.S. for control of the Western Pacific. Because if the U.S. deploys fleets from Guam, Hawaii, or the West Coast, they also have to pass through these waters to reach areas near Japan or Taiwan. The report also mentioned that, up to now, there is still a certain gap between the tonnage and the number of carrier-based aircraft on these 2 Chinese aircraft carriers and the 30 active U.S. super-nuclear-powered carriers. However, China has already built its 3rd large aircraft carrier, the Fujian, which is currently undergoing sea trials before entering service. On June 10th, the U.S. website The War Zone pointed out that the Farsi training of the Liaoning and Shandong carriers demonstrates the growing carrier strength of the Chinese Navy. But what's worth noting is that the Chinese Navy has publicly admitted to conducting dual-carrier joint exercises in these highly strategic waters. The War Zone also acknowledged that the Chinese Navy has every right to operate around the 1st and 2nd island chains, as well as in more distant waters. The operations of Chinese aircraft carriers in these areas, especially in the form of 2 carrier strike groups, carry significant strategic importance. These island chains were established by the United States as a tool of foreign policy, with their primary function being a strategic line of defense to contain naval power. By projecting its growing naval power into these areas, China is demonstrating how it can respond to the entry of the U.S. military and its allies into these key regions, as well as its ability to operate in the broader Pacific in a conflict scenario. What's even more remarkable is that when China's dual-carrier strike groups entered the 2nd island chain, the U.S. had no aircraft carriers available to respond. According to visuals released by the U.S. Naval Institute website, just as the Chinese aircraft carriers were heading straight for the 2nd island chain, there wasn't a single U.S. aircraft carrier in the vast Pacific that could approach and track the Chinese carrier groups like before. Out of the 30 active U.S. aircraft carriers, the USS George Washington in the Western Pacific had just left Yokosuka Base in Japan on June 10, while the USS Nimitz was still in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, the USS Carl Vinson in the Middle East continued to confront the Houthi forces. Apart from that, only the USS George H.W. Bush on the U.S. East Coast was active, while most of the other carriers were in the shipyard. To sum it up, firstly, if China's dual aircraft carrier fleet really did head east all the way to Hawaii as imagined by the U.S. media, who could the stretched-thin U.S. Navy actually count on for help? So don't be fooled into thinking that the U.S. has 30 active aircraft carriers and that's a huge number. In reality, the ones they can actually mobilize are mainly just those 4 or 5, and with them being deployed all over the world and stirring up trouble everywhere, it would be strange if they weren't stretched thin. Thirdly, China's deployment of a dual aircraft carrier fleet right before the China-US London talks was meant to send a warning to the U.S. If you won't respond to softer approaches, then we'll have to get tough. China's stance here is already pretty clear.